The Madeleine McCann case is one of the world's greatest mysteries. And what few know is that three crucial mistakes at the beginning of the investigation could have changed everything. Mistakes that should never have happened and that still leave questions today that no one can answer. If you want to understand the details that were ignored and how these errors shaped the Madeleine McCann case, stay with me until the end of this video. And to continue following content like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Here, every detail counts in the search for answers. Madeleine McCann's disappearance shocked the world and, to this day, is surrounded by doubts and mysteries. But what many don't know is that, even before the investigation gained momentum, three crucial mistakes jeopardized everything. And the most frightening part? They could have been avoided. Today, we will analyze these mistakes, point by point, to understand how they influenced the course of the case and what this tells us about how justice works when we need it most. The Madeleine McCann case did not start with a disappearance, but with a succession of decisions that gradually put returning to the apartment that night with hurried but still carefree steps after having dinner with friends. When she entered the bedroom and saw the empty bed, her world collapsed. And in that moment of despair, what could have been a first step towards solving the mystery became the beginning of a series of failures. Kate shouted through the corridors, calling for Madeleine, as if the girl could appear out of nowhere. Jerry, upon hearing the screams, rushed to the apartment, trying to understand what had happened. Within minutes, friends gathered, all confused and unsure of what to do. An atmosphere of panic took over, and the steps that should have been calculated were replaced by emotional chaos. Objects were touched, footprints left on the floor, and unknowingly, they destroyed the scene that could have told the truth. The first major failure happened there. No authorities were called immediately. Time was lost as they tried to decide what to do. And when the police finally arrived, the decisions made at that moment showed that they were not prepared to handle a case of this magnitude. Witnesses who could have had valuable information were not interrogated immediately. And those who ended up reporting that their statements were ignored or poorly documented. And that's when the situation became even more delicate. When the news began to circulate around the resort, curious people approached the apartment, increasing the chaos. At this point, the possibility of finding a clear trail of Madeleine was already seriously compromised. What many don't know is that while the search was beginning, time was already against them. Investigations show that in disappearance cases, the first hours are crucial. However, in Madeleine's case, those hours were marked by confusion, lack of coordination, and a terrible delay in activating the correct mechanisms. An important witness who saw a man carrying something in his arms that night was only heard days later. And the worst part, the sketch of the suspect, based on this account, was only released months after the disappearance. This allowed the man to simply disappear without a trace. The failure was not only technical, but also emotional. The investigation team, clearly pressured by the media and public opinion, made mistakes by diverting their attention to theories that ended up dominating the debates. The biggest of these theories pointed to the parents themselves as possible suspects. Kate and Jerry, who should have been receiving support, began to be treated as targets. Another crucial mistake was the lack of communication between the Portuguese and British authorities. Each side had its own approach, its own methods, and instead of working together, they created a chasm of misunderstanding. Important information was not shared in a timely manner, and clues that could have been crucial were forgotten. For example, there were reports of a car seen near the location on the night of the disappearance. Although it was a promising lead, the investigation into this car only gained attention much later, when it was too late to extract significant evidence. Now imagine this happening while the world was watching. The pressure increased every day, and instead of focusing efforts on what really mattered, locating Madeleine, the investigation seemed paralyzed between unfounded theories and lack of structure. When we think about these mistakes, we cannot help but ask ourselves, what could have been different? If the crime scene had been isolated, if the witnesses had been heard immediately, if the authorities had worked together from the beginning, could Madeleine have been found? This is the question that continues to haunt everyone involved in the case. It is not just about the system's failures, but about the human impact of these failures. Each mistake represents a lost possibility, a chance that will never be recovered. Now let's examine how these failures continue to shape discussions around the case, and why, even after so many years, we still do not have all the answers. What was promised at the beginning could not be clearer. The mistakes that marked the first days after Madeleine McCann's disappearance were crucial in shaping the course of this case. And now it is time to connect the pieces and understand how each failure influenced the fate of the investigation. Shortly after the authorities arrived, the first contradiction emerged. The Portuguese police stated that the crime scene had been preserved, but witnesses reported something quite different. In moments of chaos, family, friends, guests, and even resort staff entered and exited the apartment without any control. An investigator involved in the case later reported that more than 20 people circulated the location before any forensics were done. This destroyed any chance of capturing fingerprints, footprints, or contaminated scene in a series of assumptions, not evidence. And the most concerning issue? The lack of immediate action regarding the security cameras. Footage from the resort's surroundings could have revealed faces, cars, and suspicious movements on the night of the disappearance. But instead, many of these recordings were never requested in time and ended up lost. A revealing detail: a camera located at the resort's entrance was turned off days before, for reasons still unknown. Opportunities like matching faces with witness statements were simply discarded. Another critical point was how the witnesses were treated. A guest reported seeing a man walking towards the beach on the night of the disappearance, carrying what seemed to be a child wrapped in a blanket. This statement, which could have generated an immediate search in that direction, was questioned and even minimized by some investigators. By not taking their report seriously from the beginning, the chances of finding Madeleine, or at least the trail left, were diminished. To make matters worse, when the information finally gained attention, the possible suspect had already disappeared. These mistakes revealed something bigger: the lack of coordination among those involved in the investigation. The exchange of accusations between the local police and British authorities only further complicated the process. While one side claimed that the McCanns were not cooperating enough, the other insisted that the Portuguese police were disorganized. This blame game ended up diverting the focus from what really mattered: finding Madeleine and uncovering what happened that night. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect is how these mistakes were not only operational, but also emotional. The pressure from the media and the public turned the case into a spectacle. Investigators later admitted that the rush to show results and external influence led to hasty decisions. This explains how the parents themselves, Kate and Jerry, went from being victims to suspects, a move that divided public opinion and diverted attention from the possibility of other culprits. So, based on all this, the question remains: were these mistakes the result of incompetence or something deeper? And why, even after so many years, have the authorities still not reached a consensus on what actually happened? The silence surrounding certain decisions still echoes, and with each new revelation, new questions arise. Looking at these points, there is no way to ignore the weight of each miscalculated decision. Each mistake was a window that closed, an opportunity that slipped away. And it is precisely this that makes Madeleine's case continue to be one of the most disturbing mysteries of our time. After all, if the basics had been done differently, would we be telling a completely different story now? From the beginning, what seemed to be an investigation conducted under common protocols quickly revealed gaps that left a trail of doubts. I promised that we would highlight the 3 most critical mistakes in the Madeleine McCann case. And now each of these failures will be directly connected to the events that sealed the fate of this story. First, there was the issue of the crime scene. It was obvious that the location needed to be isolated, protected from any contamination. But what happened was the opposite. While Kate and Jerry frantically sought help, Apartment 5A of the Ocean Club was turned into a point of circulation. Guests, friends, and staff passed through the location, touching furniture, doors, and windows. According to sources close to the investigation, even the police took hours to implement any real control over who was entering or leaving. This not only erased potential traces of the kidnapper, but also made any forensic analysis an almost impossible task. What is more alarming? Witnesses claim that when the investigators finally arrived, they were not even wearing proper gloves to handle objects at the site. The second critical mistake, and perhaps the most negligent, was the failure to conduct a coordinated and effective search immediately after the disappearance was reported. In such cases, the first hours are crucial, as they can mean the difference between rescuing a victim or losing their whereabouts forever. However, instead of organizing trained teams to scour the vicinity, what was seen was a disorganized search led mainly by local residents and volunteer tourists. Meanwhile, possible escape routes were ignored. No barriers were established on nearby roads, nor were there formal records of vehicles or people who were in the area. Days later, the police admitted that they had no idea who was at the resort on the night of the disappearance, a devastating admission for a case of such magnitude. The third point directly connects to one of the most contundent criticisms of the initial investigation. The conduct of reports were given in the early hours. Many were disregarded or treated with disdain. A notable example is the testimony of Jane Tanner, one of the McCann's friends, who reported seeing a man carrying a child wrapped in a blanket near the apartment shortly after the disappearance. Instead of treating this information as a priority lead, the authorities dismissed it as irrelevant, possibly influenced by misguided assumptions that Madeleine could still be nearby. When they decided to reconsider Tanner's testimony, time had eroded any chance of locating this man or tracking his steps. These three mistakes cannot be seen as isolated events. They represent a deeper pattern of disorganization and misplaced prioritization. One of the reasons pointed out by experts is the lack of alignment between local authorities and British representatives. This tension was reflected in conflicts over how to conduct the case, delaying important decisions and diverting the focus from the search for Madeleine. Imagine the impact this had on the investigation. While the international media made sensational headlines, the core of the police work remained fragmented and confused. Additionally, there is the issue that few dare to raise. Do these mistakes reflect mere incompetence, or could they be the result of overwhelming political and media pressure? After all, high-profile cases often suffer from external interference that complicates the search for the truth. It is inevitable to wonder to what extent the need to present quick results contributed to hasty and harmful decisions. But what truly shocks when revisiting these mistakes is realizing how they left irreparable scars on the case. The absence of concrete evidence, the lack of detailed records, and the disregard for key reports created a scenario where questions remain unanswered while theories proliferate. These mistakes not only obscured the path to the truth, but also fueled decades of speculation, making the case another symbol of how things can go wrong when basic protocols are ignored. So what do these mistakes mean for the Madeleine McCann case? They remind us that the search for answers is often hindered by human failures. And above all, they leave us with a question that echoes to this day. If the basics had been done correctly, would Madeleine be with us now? It is impossible not to wonder how such a disastrous start shaped the unfolding of one of the greatest modern tragedies. The investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance has always been surrounded by controversies, but what few know is that, amidst the chaos of the early days, a crucial twist occurred, an ignored detail that could have changed the entire trajectory of the case. Returning to our hook, imagine the scene. While the world watched the frenzied media coverage, a single clue, seemingly insignificant, was discarded due to confusion and unpreparedness. Today, we will uncover how this happened and why this revelation continues to cast shadows over the case. Among the many contradictions that emerged during the investigation, one caught attention years later: the mysterious report of a local resident. She claimed to have seen a man walking down the street with a child in his arms minutes after Madeleine's disappearance. At the time, the testimony was recorded, but surprisingly, relegated to the background. The justification? According to police sources, the witness was considered unreliable, and her description was archived without further investigation. The problem is that years later, the analysis of maps and timelines suggested that the location of this man coincided with a possible escape route. If this report had been treated with the necessary seriousness, perhaps a search in that area could have led to a crucial discovery. But what makes this twist even more intriguing is what came next. The week following the disappearance, a British tourist handed authorities a photo taken on the day of the disappearance. The image showed an area near the resort, and in the background, a vague figure, seemingly carrying something bulky in his arms. For an experienced investigator, this would be a clue to be meticulously analyzed. However, the photo was set aside amidst the volume of documents arriving daily. The photographer reported that months later, he realized he was never called to provide further clarifications. Years later, when the image was re-examined, forensic analysis experts stated that it could contain traces of clothing similar to what Madeleine was wearing that night, a detail that, at the time, could have directed the case. And then comes the greatest irony: the failure to connect seemingly disconnected reports and evidence. The local witness's testimony and the tourist's photograph were separated by files and bureaucracies that prevented them from being seen. Investigators suggested that the man described by the witness could be the same vaguely captured in the photograph. However, this possibility was never fully explored by the Portuguese police at the time, nor by the British forces that took over the case later. The separation between the investigation teams created an almost insurmountable barrier to information exchange, hindering any attempt to connect the dots before it was too late. What this reveals to us is not just a mistake, but a cascade of institutional failures that compromised the case from the start. While this evidence was ignored, the focus of the international media and local authorities turned to speculations and theories that, in hindsight, diverted attention from what really mattered. Concrete clues. Years later, experts in child disappearances publicly criticized the lack of coordination between Portuguese and British authorities, citing this episode as a clear example of how poor communication can seal a case's fate. And here is the question that haunts us. Could Madeleine McCann have been found, or at least the case clarified, if these clues had been handled more carefully? The answers are as nebulous as the mystery surrounding her disappearance. What is evident, however, is that the negligence in the investigation's early days resulted in gaps that are impossible to fill. The impact of this goes beyond Madeleine's case. This twist forces us to reflect on how human failures, bureaucracy, and hasty decisions can shape the course of events that should, in theory, be handled with the utmost rigor. And, more disturbing still, it leaves us wondering how many other cases remain unsolved due to similar errors. Untold stories, lives never rescued. And while this piece of the puzzle remains out of place, Madeleine's mystery continues, more alive than ever, but still full of questions that echo, unanswered over time. The failures we analyze today are not just part of Madeleine McCann's past, they continue to echo, raising doubts about the system's ability to handle such delicate and urgent situations. And honestly, looking at all this, it's hard not to question, was there even a genuine effort to correct the mistakes made, or were they simply covered up over the years? My opinion is clear. These three mistakes, the initial unpreparedness of the police, the negligence with crucial evidence, and the lack of coordination between authorities, not only delayed the searches but created an almost impossible chasm to overcome. More than a case, this has become a symbol of human and institutional fragilities. And the most frustrating part is knowing that, even after so much time, these issues remain without clear answers. There is no ignoring that for Madeleine, every minute lost that night cost much more than we can imagine. But this is just the beginning of a long conversation. There are more mysteries, more pieces of this puzzle that remain unsolved. In the next video, we will address something that few have dared to discuss to this day. Who was really present behind the scenes of the case? And what information never came to light? You won't want to miss it. If you've watched up to here, comment, "I am a guardian of the mystery," so I know you are committed to uncovering stories like this one. And if you have suggestions or something you think we should investigate, leave them in the comments. Let's continue this journey together. Oh, and don't forget, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. Your support is essential for us to bring more in-depth analyses and stories that challenge our understanding. The next video is waiting for you. Click now and let's uncover another part of this story together.